Before moving on to talking about the money, as Bali mentioned, I want to point out and maybe give a little shout out to our manual, this one right here. Make sure that everyone has a copy of this. I know that sometimes talking about entity formation and governance and things like that can be a bit overwhelming, and so we've put a lot of work and more detail into the manual about these topics. So if you still have more questions, of course, write them down on your comment card or look at the manual, which is both on the USB we gave you and in paper format. We have more in the back if you haven't received one yet. Okay, so my name is Kristen Corpian. I'm a second-year law student at Berkeley, and I'm also a law clerk with the GC3 clinic. I've spent my time really working and thinking about how worker cooperatives raise money. And that's a good thing. That's what I want to talk about today. I want to think back to our Green Commonwealth example, our skit from earlier. Once they decide that they want to form as a worker cooperative, what entity and how to govern, they start thinking about how are we going to buy shovels? How are we going to buy lawnmowers, fertilizer? How are we going to rent a space to work out of, or trucks? And so, it's good. And so, obviously, they need money to do those things. In order to think about how worker cooperatives go about raising money, it's important to compare to how traditional businesses go about raising money. In a traditional business, you might think of one person who has a great idea, and they want to go public with the idea. So they might use their personal savings to really get off the ground. And then when they're thinking about expanding, they might approach a venture capitalist or try and seek a private bank loan. They might use other alternatives, but those are really the first kinds of things you think of, private bank loans and venture capitalists. And they use these to grow and eventually become a successful business. Worker cooperatives are slightly different in that they begin with a group idea. And the group comes together, they decide that they all want to be members, and they all have to contribute an amount indicated in the bylaws to join the cooperative. That might be $300, it might be more than that. And they all put that together instead of just their personal savings. And if they want to contribute personal savings, they might do this by making member loans to the business, that the business will eventually pay back to the member over time. And the reason that this happens is you don't want, let's say, a very wealthy member to really take control in the way that a traditional business would have that happen. So if there is a particularly wealthy member, they would make a loan to the cooperative, and the cooperative would pay that back over time as it could. But this way, not one member retains, that sort of power over the other group. But at the end of the day, if you have a wealthy member that's willing to contribute, either through a loan or through donations, you want to take advantage of that. Sorry. Thank you. And so when the worker cooperative has sort of maxed out this member contribution and member loans, they might want to expand, and they might start thinking about traditional financing options. They might start thinking, well, what if I approach a bank for a loan? Or what if I approach a venture capitalist? And unfortunately, the research that we've done really suggests that venture capital isn't the best idea for worker cooperatives, because venture capitalists a lot of times want to take a certain amount of ownership in the business that worker cooperatives don't want to give up. The core of worker cooperatives is this idea that we control this business. We don't so much want to go public. We want to stay local. So a lot of times venture capital doesn't really pan out for worker cooperatives. And then in terms of bank loans, that's also a bit of a challenge, because financial institutions really want to see a higher equity to debt ratio. And what that means is when you approach a bank, a lot of times, for example, let's say you want a $25,000 loan. They may want to see that you already have $20,000 saved up to be able to pay that loan back, and you might not have that. So it's difficult at times for worker cooperatives to get a large banking loan from private institutions or even from local banks. And let me also mention, we're having one of the breakout groups that's actually going to talk more about these sources of funding. It's not the case that worker cooperatives can't get loans at all, and we have some really great people. So if you're more interested in traditional sources of funding, you really want to join the finance and governance breakout group, which will be right over there. Okay. So I mentioned some of these challenges in obtaining traditional sources of funding, but I really want to lace that by talking about a success story within the East Bay, Alchemy Collective Cafe. And I actually sat down and talked with one of the founding members of Alchemy Collective Cafe, Chris, and I asked him a bit about how his business, which is pretty successful in the community, or him and the other partners' business, how they went about raising money to get started, to get off the ground. And at first, they really did a lot of the things that I was telling you about. They used personal savings, member contributions, member loans, and they were doing a really good job of going to farmers markets and selling their coffee, but they wanted to expand from that. They wanted to grow further. And so I asked him, what did you do to get there, and what were your goals? His goal was to move from farmers markets and get a coffee cart. And so I've seen it, and it's actually very large, and he has these great coffee machines, but those things cost money, and he didn't really have that. He was really just breaking even at the farmers markets. So he said, we really got creative. And he wanted me to stress that to everyone here, that when you're thinking about financing, you really have to be creative. And how he was creative was by using not a new idea, but a form of donations called crowdfunding. And he did that based on a website called Kickstarter. And that's where you present your idea online. And Kickstarter isn't the only website, but that's the one he used. He presented his idea online, and by presenting his idea, he also laid out that he would need $10,000 to be able to reach his goal of getting his awesome coffee cart. And he laid out this idea, and people go online, they check out the project, and then they donate funds. So they're not expecting a return, although you can give out coffee mugs or shirts in thank you for them donating the money. But the great thing is that he was actually able to raise $10,000 to do what he wanted to do. And so since then, he's moved from farmers markets to this awesome space in Berkeley, and I went there, and it's just a gorgeous shop. And he was able to do that by being creative. So there are sometimes challenges to obtaining funding as a worker cooperative, but there are plenty of alternatives that you can use to raise money, and that's really great. And Alchemy Collective Cafe is an example of that. So a big thank you to them for speaking to me and answering my pestering questions about money. And definitely if you get a chance, go over there and grab some coffee. It's really delicious. Okay, so I talked a little bit about traditional sources of funding, but there are alternative sources of funding that I want to lay out for you, and they're more detailed in the manual again, but I just want to point them out now if you're thinking about how you want to go about raising money. I mentioned earlier membership capital, membership contributions. One way to start raising money is, let's say, we're thinking back to the Green Commonwealth. There were 4 of them. Each of them might make a membership contribution of $300. And then they've raised money right there that they can put back into the business. Another example, as I mentioned also, are donations. Reaching out to your friends and family, people in your network, and telling them what a great idea you have, and asking them to support it. A lot of time that's really effective. And one form of receiving donations is crowdfunding and that website Kickstarter that I told you about. Additional sources, additional alternatives to raising money are microloans. And microloans are small interest rate loans, usually offered by, groups that are socially conscious that want to help out small businesses. And so the loans are a bit smaller, but they're offered by people who a lot of times have their heart in the right place. And, it's a bit different than dealing with a private bank who might, see things a little differently. And we actually, I'm not sure if we might have people here from Kiva, a microloan company, who will be able to talk to you again in the finance and government breakout. The second alternative is pre-selling. And really that's just the concept of you sell something maybe for a little bit less than it's worth to bring in money. And an example of that would be our Green Commonwealth landscaping company selling $150 worth of services for $100. And that's a way to, increase money into the business and raise funds. And lastly, a unique way of obtaining funds is bartering. And a lot of times people don't think about this. It's not so much obtaining funds, I said that incorrectly, obtaining resources. You might want to exchange 10 hours of landscaping work with another business for, let's say, fertilizer or a lawnmower or shovels. And these sort of exchanges are a really useful way to obtain resources that a lot of people maybe don't think about or discount. But I think they're a really valuable source and something you should consider. Okay. Raising money triggers securities law, which is a complex area of the law that I'm going to ask Janelle to speak to you about.